kind of like wine and cheese half an hour after you've brushed your teeth with mint toothpaste. Hello whisky fans, how you doing? Today we've got Ardbeg Fermutation. So this is a whisky that needs little introduction because it is an Ardbeg committee special release, and as with all Ardbeg committee releases, they are overhyped to hell and everyone's going to have heard of this and the backstory about it probably. So I'm going to do a quick rundown of the label and we'll get straight into it. So this Ardbeg Fermutation, obviously fermutation is fermentation, mutation. The ABV of this one is 49.4%. It is non-chill filtered. There's no mention of whether it's got added colouring or not, but from the colour of this and the fact that it's Ardbeg, probably is natural colour, but it would be nice if they would tell us. Also doesn't make any mention of whether or not this is cask strength. Being 49.4% ABV and 13 years old, because we have got an age statement on this as well, almost certainly you'd think it's not cask strength, which kind of raises the question of why go for such an odd figure as 49.4, but Ardbeg kind of do have a history of going for very odd, seemingly nonsensical decimal ABVs for no reason. Sometimes they are equivalent of old UK proof figures converted to ABV. This time it doesn't seem like it is. So have they just gone for that really odd number to make people think that it's cask strength when it's probably not? No idea. We also know from the website and the emails that Ardbeg have sent out, because there isn't a box or tube with this, which is kind of a good thing. If you're not going to be collecting it, you don't need it and it's just extra waste. But on the website and the emails, Ardbeg have said that this has matured in a combination of first fill and refill bourbon casks. So it's not been messed around too much in terms of cask maturation. It's a fairly honest and open maturation that's hopefully going to allow the fairly unique spirit in this one to actually shine through for what it is. The price of this one though, and it pains me to say this because we have had some still expensive but more reasonably priced releases in terms of Ardbeg committee releases. I believe the Ardbeg Scotch committee release and the Ardbeg 8-year-old for discussion committee release, they were both a bit cheaper than this because this one comes in at £150. So this is a 13-year-old Ardbeg. It's 49.4% ABV, so you're kind of paying 3 times the price of your normal Ardbeg 10 for an extra 3 years and an extra 3 and a bit ABV. So something that a lot of people are going to be interested with this one is it good value for money? Is it worth the price? And no, it's not. It's insanely overpriced for a 13-year-old, seemingly non-cask strength whiskey. For anyone out there that can't afford to try this, it's not worth the price that Ardbeg are asking for, and it's certainly not worth any higher price than that on the secondary market. If you are a collector that's still kind of trying to keep up with the special releases from Ardbeg, trying to get one of every bottle, I really feel sorry for you because they are kind of gouging us a little bit on this one. So yes, I do think that this one is insanely and unfairly overpriced for what it is. I think it's a unique Ardbeg, which I'll get to in a minute, and if you can try this or buy a reasonably priced small sample, I'd really encourage you to do so because it is unique and interesting. But as for buying a full bottle of this and paying through the nose to do so, I really can't recommend it. So am I contributing to the hype and scarcity and hysteria on this one? Probably a little bit, but the reason that I bought this is because I have a little bit of a history, a little bit of experience with homebrewing, and the details on this one and what makes this special really piqued my interest, because the backstory of this one is that back in 2007 all of the boilers went offline at Ardbeg, and that's a serious problem if you're fermenting beer or trying to ferment your wort to make whiskey, because fermentation requires live yeast and yeast requires a reasonably stable and warmish temperature, or it just goes into a state of dormancy and stops working. So back when this happened at Ardbeg, they had this terrible situation that they had 6 washbacks full of wort, which is essentially fermenting beer in progress. And because the area where the washbacks are situated became very cold, all of the yeast that they'd pitched into there all became dormant, stopped fermenting. So it's a bit of a disaster. The first thing that springs to mind is that you're going to have to throw away all of this sort of fermenting wort and start again once the boilers get back online. It's one of the problems that you have whenever you're fermenting beer or wort to make distilled spirits, is that once you've got all of those sugars extracted from the starches in the grains and you've got them in a liquid state and they're ready to ferment, if you don't pitch your yeast and get a healthy amount of live yeast circulating through the liquid as soon as possible, you're very open to getting infections, bacteria, getting their way into the wort, and they can produce some horrendous off notes and even make you sick. Now, what they actually did at Ardbeg in 2007 is Dr. Bill Lumsden, he had the idea of apparently opening the lids on the washbacks, opening all of the unfermented wort to the air, to the elements, to any particles or bacteria or wild yeast strains that are floating in on the air from outside, and just seeing what happens. And it's obviously implied, I don't think it actually explicitly states anywhere, but they're implying that all those wild yeast strains, because there's yeast and mould and pollen and bacteria and spores everywhere in all of the air that we're surrounded by at all times, and they allowed these wild yeast strains and possibly bacteria too access into the washbacks, and they just crossed everything that they had, that some of that wild yeast would get in there and finish off the fermentation for them. And it obviously worked, because several years later we have Ardbeg Fermutation, which is the product of that very strangely fermented batch of wort. I will say at this point that this is possibly a unique whisky. It's not unheard of for some beers, especially craft ales, to be made with strains of natural wild yeast. They, from my experience, they do tend to be kind of very craft presented European craft ales, things like that. And these ales that some people are making on the continent with these strains of wild yeast, they tend to have some very interesting sort of funky off notes. They can be quite challenging, but they do always tend to be quite interesting. One thing that I was really interested in about this new Ardbeg is that they said that the fermentation, when it actually sort of picked up again and it eventually got to a state where they had enough alcohol in the washbacks for it to be worth taking it out and actually running it through the stills, they said that that fermentation that's normally done at Ardbeg in 72 hours actually ended up taking 3 weeks. So a fermentation that normally takes you 3 days turned into a 3-week fermentation. So 72 hours is probably fairly typical for a lot of whisky distilleries, but a 3-week fermentation period is incredibly long for anything going into Scotch whisky. Saying that, having such a long fermentation period that can be measured in weeks or even months is definitely not unheard of when you're talking about the production of craft beer. Anyone that's done like one of the basic kits that you get in a can of homebrew, you might have seen that the instructions sometimes say that it'll be ready to drink in 7 days or maybe even 5 days. Some homebrew kits and instructions for homebrew, they definitely do say that it can be ready in that short space of time, and they're wrong. You always, when you're making homebrew beer, get a better result if you leave it for a longer period of time, often a much longer period of time. A lot of people, when they're doing homebrew, more experienced homebrewers, they'll leave a beer for several weeks or even months, and some of the best homebrew that I've made myself has been left for several months. Yeast is an incredibly strange thing, and for fans of alcohol like us, it's an incredibly convenient thing that we have it on this planet at our disposal. It's kind of halfway between flora and fauna, and it behaves in some very strange ways. Like I mentioned before, if the temperature drops too cold, like it did at Ardbeg with this batch, yeast can go into a dormant state where it doesn't do much at all. And on the other hand, if a yeast is exposed to too high temperatures, it can go crazy and produce a lot of alcohol in a very short time. And in that situation, it can approach those edible sugars in the wort in a completely different way, and if it's too hot and too active, it can come out with a lot of sometimes very unpleasant, very simple and not particularly desirable flavours in your beer. Another interesting thing about yeast is that if you give yeast too much food, it goes crazy, quickly devouring all of those sugars and excreting the alcohol that we then turn into our fermented alcohol beverages. But it produces alcohol so quickly, so rapidly, that it actually makes its own environment hostile. Some microbiologists think that the mechanism where yeast consumes sugar and excretes alcohol might actually be a defense mechanism, because that alcohol kind of sterilizes the environment that the yeast is in and prevents other strains of yeast or bacteria from colonizing that food source that the yeast is feeding on. So given enough resources, yeast is something which quickly depletes those resources and turns its environment into a toxic, hostile place that it can no longer live in. That sounds a bit familiar, doesn't it? But anyway, the point is that temperature has a huge effect on yeast, and generally when you're talking about homebrew and beer, people tend to prefer a cooler and longer fermentation because it not only produces more palatable strains of alcohol in the finished product, but allowing that yeast to sit in the fermenting liquid and allow it to exist after all of the readily available sugar is consumed. The yeast actually goes into a different mode, and it begins to clean up the liquid and remove a lot of those compounds which can also contribute to off flavours. So long fermentations almost always a really good thing in terms of making beer. So that is why when they announced this one, when they announced that it's going to be £150, that put me right off. But when I heard about the long fermentation, I kind of had to give it a go. And it really was that mention of the long fermentation that I was really interested in. Because I think with the label on this one, and that little cartoon, I quite like the label on this one. I like the colour scheme. The camera refuses to look at it, but it is there. But the little cartoon scene with the flying washbacks, like UFOs, it's they're kind of riffing on the idea that it's all of these strains of wild yeast invading the distillery and having an influence on the spirit. But I really didn't care about the whole wild yeast angle. It was really that long fermentation that had me interested. Just show you the back label for anyone that's interested that hasn't seen it. So there's a bunch of marketing stuff on there, and on the side there, that's actually meant to be the view looking up from inside the washback, with I think all of the distillery staff and the Ardbeg dog, is that Shorty, looking down into the washback. So when I first heard about this, I was expecting one of a few things. Now the thing that I was most interested to see is, does that long fermentation period, is that going to clean up the Ardbeg wort and give you something that's much fruitier, more refined, and perhaps a little bit cleaner than your average Ardbeg? I also did have my fears that that long fermentation might knock down the phenol content of the finished whisky with this one, because the phenols in whisky and phenols in anything, they're a volatile compound. They're constantly releasing themselves, they're constantly evaporating off and being released into the air. So anytime a peated liquid is exposed to air, that's an opportunity for those phenols to be lost. And that's why you'll quite often see your older peated whiskies, they don't have the same peatiness as your younger whiskies do, because that exposure to air, it goes for wort that's in a washback as much as it does to whisky that's exposed to that small volume of air inside a cask. And lastly, there's a little bit of me that feared that it was possible that it's going to be almost exactly the same, maybe just a little bit older from those extra 3 years as the normal Ardbeg 10, because for all of this talk about the extra long fermentation period having a refining and cleaning effect on the fluid that goes into the stills, Ardbeg is not a distillery that needs crutches. What they produce is already very good. So was a little bit concerned that I'd just wasted £150. So let's get straight into it. Already wasted far too much time. Let's get some in the glass, see what it's like. And obviously, as always, even though Literally received delivery of this a couple of days ago. The level's still pretty high. I have tried this before I've done this review, because when I can help it, I never do a review based on just a dram or a neck fill. So already, fantastic whiskey, smells absolutely fantastic, but is it any different? So the first thing I notice on the nose of this Ardbeg Fermutation 13-year-old committee release is that it's a very fruity Ardbeg, and it's probably a little bit lighter than the average Ardbeg. Those fruity notes, I'm getting some banana, some peach, as well as some fresh apple notes in there, but it's not your green apples, and it's not your kind of orchard fruit Speyside notes. It's kind of like a freshly cut red apple note. Also getting some ashy dry smoke. And the thing that I find most interesting about this Ardbeg is that it's got something that I don't think I've ever experienced in any Ardbeg before, and that's that it's very lactic. It's got a real kind of smoked natural yogurt note, and it's immediately identifiable, and it's very present all the way through this whiskey. That lactic note is something that a lot of people are going to be absolutely disgusted by and despise. This whiskey is definitely not for everyone. But that lactic note, I'm also getting a little bit of a kind of slightly sweaty blue cheese note. But it's a kind of properly made blue cheese note, you know, the kind of traditional ones, where you've got that lovely blue cheese quality but without the extreme metallic tanginess that you get in some cheaper blue cheese. Also getting some musty citrus notes on the nose, and I think that citrus, along with those creamy lactic blue cheese note, it really gives me an impression of kind of like a key lime pie. Also quite a bit of mint and menthol note on the nose. And again, I think it's the combination of that and those lactic, milky dairy quality that kind of reminds me of those Viscount mint chocolate biscuits that you used to get in the UK. Either that, or because it's also it's got quite a sugary sweetness to it. That lactic dairy note with the mint menthol and the sugariness kind of reminds me of something like Kendal mint cake. So there's some very UK-centric tasting notes out there for you. If you had any idea what I've been talking about for the last 30 seconds, congratulations. I would say chances are you're probably British. It's definitely a really interesting and also quite complex nose. It's kind of like wine and cheese half an hour after you've brushed your teeth with mint toothpaste. Anyway, on the palate. Fantastic natural looking colour on that one. Bearing in mind that they've definitely used at least some first fill bourbon casks in this, although not to the extent where it's a problem, definitely not a vanilla bomb, not overly sweet. I'd say that that's probably the amount of colour that you'd expect to see an Ardbeg pick up over 13 years from a combination of fresh and refill bourbon casks. So really is a shame that they don't think it's important that we need to know that it's natural colour, but it probably is. On the palate though, it's actually rather a delicate. I'm wary of using the word light. I wouldn't go that far. It's not mild on the palate, but it's a delicate, dry, ashy smokiness on the palate. Especially the arrival is definitely quite smoky, not enormously peaty. I think that the peat has evolved into something else, and that's possibly because of that extra long fermentation time. All of those phenols and all of those wonderful chemical compounds have had a chance to turn into something other than just raw brute power smokiness. Also getting quite a bit of wood smoke on the early palate. A little bit of a chicory barbecue wood smoke note. Probably would say that it's not to this whiskey's detriment, but it is lighter and more refined and a little bit more chiseled than your average Ardbeg 10, with a delicate creaminess on the palate. Some lovely salty notes, kind of like smoky, salty bacon. And I think later on the palate, you do get some really nice, bright, fruity spirit notes and a little bit of aniseed poking through. As for the finish, I'm going to say that it's a long finish, not enormously bold all the way through the finish. It does taper off, but it is long and lingering. But again, it is that little bit delicate with a lovely, creamy, slightly cheesy maltiness right on the death of the finish. As for a grade, I'm going to give this one an A-, because despite being horrendously overpriced, and it is fantastic whiskey, as almost all whiskey from Ardbeg is, because I think I gave the Ardbeg 10-year-old an A- as well, or thereabouts. I'd say that in terms of quality, it's at the same level as the Ardbeg 10. In terms of being interesting and unique, that does elevate it that little bit, but in terms of actually buying good value, good quality whiskey, you're not getting anything out of this that you don't get out of the Ardbeg 10, because the Ardbeg 10 is already one of the best whiskies that have ever been available, probably, especially when you take into consideration the low cost and extremely high quality presentation that is offered at. But in my opinion, and I think this one is going to be a bit divisive, it's going to polarise Ardbeg fans possibly, it's going to be a little bit too much on the funky side for some people. Me personally, I welcome that. I think that it's a really nice addition, but my verdict really is that it's on the same level as the Ardbeg 10. So what happened here? What was the mutation? What happened to this? What had the effect? Why is this whiskey so different to the Ardbeg 10? Because it is noticeably very different, and I don't think that it's those extra 3 years or the slightly higher ABV that's done that. Whatever happened to this whiskey, and I personally think that the long fermentation time has had a large part in what happened, it's given us a cleaner, slightly more refined Ardbeg. It does seem that little bit more mature, which again I think is not just because it is 3 years older, I think it's more than that. But those slight off notes, for want of a better word, those interesting lactic notes that I've found on this whiskey, where are they coming from? As I said, it could just be down to the fact that it's had so much more time in the washbacks. The yeast has had so much more time to do its job, and as I said before, in terms of homebrew, after the yeast has finished its job, the yeast then goes into a different mode of operation, and it goes around in the wort and it cleans things up. It hoovers up all of those off notes and just finishes off the wort. Some of those different notes and different characteristics could just be because the peat has been knocked down that little bit, because it is that little bit more refined. Maybe because the peat is that little bit lower in intensity. Perhaps that is allowing things that are there in the standard Ardbeg 10 to be more noticeable. And I think another possibility, something that could definitely have happened, and I didn't expect to say this, it could be from those strains of wild yeast. I think after trying this whiskey, it's definitely a possibility, as far-fetched as I thought that it sounded when they were first talking about opening the washbacks. And I still think that sounds a little bit daft. If you've got a large volume of sugary liquid that you want to ferment, you don't just let everything in there hoping that there'll be some bizarre cold temperature resistant strain of wild yeast that will go in there and do the same job as your standard brewers or distillers yeast. That does seem a bit daft, but I think that especially the lactic notes that I'm getting on this could be at least partially to do with some strains of wild yeast having an impact on the final flavour profile, or possibly an impact from a minor bacterial infection that's got into the washbacks. Because, like I said before, if you've got a large volume of sugary liquid, as soon as you expose that to the outside environment, there's always the chance that you'll get bacteria that will go in there, and especially if it's an early stage in the fermentation, if the boilers went down before the yeast had been pitched and had a chance to do anything at all, there's definitely a high chance that you had at least a low-level bacterial infection having an impact on the flavour profile as well. Because at that point you wouldn't have the alcohol content in the wort to fight anything that went in. All in all though, apart from being horrendously overpriced, and it really is, I think that it's a really interesting experiment that Ardbeg have done, and it's been really great to be able to try this. And like I said before, if you get a chance to try a sample of this or have a dram from someone else's bottle, I'd really recommend that you do. I don't think that this is something that I'd want to see done to every batch of Ardbeg, but I think that the important thing with this Ardbeg Fermutation is that it's solid, concrete proof of the dramatic impact of long fermentation times, and shows the kind of thing that other distilleries really should be experimenting with, at least to some extent, or at least be aware of. Anyway, that's about all from me. Love to hear your thoughts on this one, or any theories that you might have on fermentation or the production of whiskey. Thanks for watching, and cheers.